about negative externalities. So here's an example. Turn the light down a little bit. You can kind of read it. When there's a negative externality present, you have the private marginal cost right here. You have the social marginal cost right there. So all of society would prefer to produce up here, but because these, whatever firm is involved in production, they don't bear all the cost of whatever they're doing. In this case, they don't bear the cost of pollution. They're going to end up not taking those costs into account. So we end up producing more than is efficient in the market. When we produce too many as compared to our equilibrium, what ends up happening is we have dead weight loss. Last time dead weight loss, when we talked about it, was because too few were being produced in the last chapter. Now we're looking at where too much is being produced. So we have this dead weight loss on the other side. But just like before, I wanted to hit this again so you guys remember it. It's a difference between the equilibrium, what would be efficient, and what's actually going on. In this case, too much, so we're on the other side. Yeah, I'm basically just reminding you that when there's a negative externality present, when we're not taking all the costs into account, then we end up producing too much compared to equilibrium. It would be best for society if we were producing right here, and we were charging this higher price. But because we're not taking those costs into account, the producers aren't physically able to, we end up with a lower market price and a higher quantity being bought and sold in the market. All right, so that pollution example is one negative externality in production. Negative externalities can also result from consumption. As I said, like cigarette smoke was one of those. So you have an individual consuming cigarettes, smoking it, and that's bothering someone else. They're not taking into account the annoyance of the smell of cigarettes for other people that don't smoke, or the potential for secondhand smoke to cause health problems, things like that. So it can be either producers or it could be consumers that are causing this externality. But just like in the previous example, we're going to have too much being produced, too much being bought and sold, because no one's taking into account that cost of cigarette smoking. So we end up with the same thing, with too many cigarettes being consumed. Externalities can also be positive. So in the case where the private benefit being received by consumers is less than the social benefit, we end up with a positive externality. In this case, we see the exact opposite of what happens with the negative externality, as you can imagine, because positive is the opposite of negative. We end up with too little being produced. So consumers don't bear or don't receive the full benefit from their actions. Other people are also made better off. So because of that, they're not going to purchase as much as would be efficient in the market. So I'll look at college education as an example. And of course, a textbook that's being used in college courses is going to pick college education as a positive externality. So in this case, we have just the market supply curve with no externality coming from that. But we have the marginal private benefit here, D1, and the marginal social benefit here, D2. So this is what consumers, this is what you guys are getting. Obviously, you go to college, you end up getting a higher paying job. I forget, but when you come here, they tell you like how much more money you earn in a lifetime over just getting a high school degree from going to college. So you get a decent amount of benefit. Maybe there's, I don't know, you enjoy being educated, you enjoy the experience of being in college. But society also gets some sort of benefit. Well then, it's better to live in a society with more educated people. Educated people are less likely to commit crimes. If you have more educated people, it's more likely to have entrepreneurs. You have these better products being created. So because of this, consumers, you guys don't get the full benefit. You're getting this much, so you're only willing to spend, on this demand curve. but society is getting this benefit out here. So students, consumers are going to consume a college education. They're going to go and pay to go to college and pay for classes and all that. Where this marginal private benefit curve, or this demand curve, crosses the supply curve, so right here. So we end up with a market price here at P market, and the quantity being demanded, being bought and sold at P market. Now, if you guys could take into account the benefit that society gets from you going to college and getting more educated, in that case, there would be a higher price that you'd be willing to pay, because then, again, you're getting a greater benefit from this. There would also be more college education being consumed. Maybe some of you guys will go on to grad school. Maybe it would just be more people showing up to go to college. But if you were able to capture those social benefits, you would consume more college. More consumers would go to college. Because we're not taking that into account, we end up with too little being produced, too little being consumed. So right here, Q market, that's what's being consumed right now because there's this positive externality, this benefit that you guys aren't getting. If you were able to, you have more consumption of college out here at Q efficient, so we end up with a dead weight loss again. The difference between what's actually being consumed on the market and what's the efficient level, the socially optimal level, so what's best for all of society. And this is the dead weight loss we're used to from the previous chapter. A little triangle right there. So just to summarize, when there's a positive externality in either producing or consuming a good or service, too little that good or service is going to be produced and consumed. So market equilibrium, the market forces don't move us towards equilibrium. It doesn't work like I've talked about, so far in this course. We end up with too little being consumed, too little being produced in this market suffering from inefficiencies. So when there's negative or positive externalities, the market equilibrium is not going to result in the efficient quantity being produced. So in a normal situation in the market where consumers bear the full cost and get the full benefit, producers bear the full cost, get the full benefit of, they get the full price, they're not being charged a distorted tax. We end up with the efficient amount being produced, what we call the socially optimal, the best for society. Because each individual faces the cost of their actions and gets the full benefit for both sides, so for firms and for consumers, we end up with what's best for society. But when there's externalities present, we don't end up with that. When there's a negative externality, so we're not bearing the full cost of these actions, of these products, we end up with overproduction. We end up with too much because we're not able to take those costs into account. And remember, this isn't someone choosing to ignore these costs. This is we're unable to bear these costs. For pollution, that's spread out over everyone. There's no way, very difficult to imagine a way to force producers to bear the cost of pollution. Likewise, with positive externalities, we end up with underproduction because people can't bear or can't get the full benefit of what they're doing. They're going to consume too little compared to what's socially optimal. Both of these cases are going to result in dead weight loss. Remember, dead weight loss occurs when too little is being produced or consumed, or too much is being produced or consumed. Anytime we're not in equilibrium, we end up with this dead weight loss from transactions that should take place that don't take place, or transactions that do take place but shouldn't. So if we're producing here at the efficient market quantity, right there at this equilibrium, we've maximized both consumer surplus up here and producer surplus down here. When there, in this case, an externality present, so we're producing it down here, we end up again with this dead weight loss. We haven't maximized producer and consumer surplus like we do in this efficient market equilibrium. So when there are externalities present, either positive or negative, it's an example of what's called a market failure. Basically, market failure is just a situation where the market fails to produce the efficient level of output. There is this socially optimal level of output, socially optimal price, but we're not there. We're producing either too little or too much. So that's a market failure. It can be caused by externalities, it can be caused by other things. And we'll give a few other examples later on in the course. And the larger the externality, the greater the size of the deadweight loss, so the greater market failure we're gonna have. If there's just a very small externality, odds are we'll produce too little or too much by just a little bit, just by maybe a few units. So that will be a small deadweight loss, it won't be a big deal. But if there's large externalities, if we're polluting a lot and it's very difficult to breathe, whether it's like Pittsburgh back in the 70s, just like covered in soot, or whether it's the smog in California back in the 60s and 70s, if there's a really large externality, there's gonna be a huge deadweight loss. So we may not really care if there's a slight externality, whether it's negative or positive, but when they're large, this causes a very significant market failure. And it's something, at that point, that policymakers can't ignore it. So they need to find a solution. And we'll be going over some solutions. I'm not just gonna be talking about problems. So you think about, wouldn't it be great if we could just make those people pay for pollution? We could somehow force them to take that into account. We could do that, and we wouldn't have the externality. If we could somehow get you guys to bear the full benefit of going to college, you get all of it, that would solve the externality problem. So there are a couple of ways we can do this. We can use private solutions or we can use government solutions. We'll start with private solutions, which is called the Coase theorem. So externalities, they come about because of incomplete property rights. Right, so think of the pollution example. The reason why we have this negative externality with pollution is because there's no property rights to clean air. No one has, air of their own that they could charge someone for polluting. Even sounds kind of stupid for me to stand up here and say this. But if you own like a yard and someone dumps, waste on your yard, you can charge them for that. You can take them to court and sue them for it. Very difficult to do with air. So because we have these incomplete property rights, we end up with this externality. If we could somehow create property rights in this case, then we could reach a solution. We wouldn't have the externality present anymore. So property rights are the rights for individuals or businesses to have the exclusive use of something. This includes the right to buy or sell it, the right to improve it, the right to exclude others from using it. And these can be physical or intangible objects. So it could be your laptop. It could be, it could be like trademarks or patents. So it could be like an idea you created. All right, so Coase, he had this idea, if we could try to create property rights in some of these cases, we could get rid of the externality. We can just have two sides bargain and pay each other for the right to pollute or right to not pollute, to not be polluted. Externalities take a lot of forms, so I'll go through a bit of a humorous example. One of my favorite examples of externalities in movies. You guys remember the movie Neighbors?
In your neighborhood.
Hi, it's a fabulous neighborhood.
In your neighborhood.
Look, new neighbors.
Oh. Is that a fraternity?
I think they'll like us.
We're hip, we're cool.
there, sweetie? Is that a balloon? That's not a balloon! Oh, Jesus! Oh, gross! Are you ready for a show? It was an expensive bush.
I'm sorry, I felt inspiration.
I'm about to rip it out of the ground. Ah!
Use the hips. It'll come easier.
Come on!
There it is.
Just stop doing this stupid stuff!
Why are you dressing up like Robert De Niro?
Are you talking to me? I get what you're doing.
I'm watching you. I'm watching you, Falcon.
Come get some. Oh!
Sorry, my ball just got in your face.
I'm pissed off. They underestimated us. I don't want to take the gloves off, but I'm gonna take them off.
You have no idea what you started. Welcome to the darkness, bitches.
A frat broke into the car and stole all the airbags.
So weird.
Why don't they just break in and steal the
I
airbags?
don't
It
know.
doesn't...
Follow police. Delta Psi has the upper hand.
All right, so who has, let's talk about the property rights in this case. We've got the frat house and we've got their neighbors next door. All right, so both the fraternity and the couple next door have property rights to their home, right? They own it, they have exclusive use to it. But where are their incomplete property rights? Where's the issue coming from here? Noise. Yeah, no one has clear property rights over to, I don't know, the sound around them. Again, this sounds stupid to say because there are no property rights there, so we don't have a way to conceptualize this. Or at least I don't have a way to conceptualize it to make me not sound stupid up here. If there's noise, is there anything else? There's trash. So yeah, you have these late night parties and they're creating a lot of noise and keeping the family up at night, and they're creating a bunch of trash that's blowing over there. Now the trash is something, there are clear property rights there to their yard, so it is something they can settle, but it's a problem they're facing. So the property rights for the house for each of them are secure, but the noise is this big problem we're facing, or they're facing in the movie. So that's a solution they need to reach. So they could go to the police to try to settle it, or, and that is something they try to do in the movie, or they could just try to reach an agreement between the two of them. So that was Ronald Coase's idea. Ronald Coase, he won the Nobel Prize for this, and the paper this is based on was the most cited paper since World War II. So this is really big for economists. Basically what he argues, and what he tries to describe and to prove, is that private parties can get together and they can bargain with each other to solve the externality problem. So as long as property rights are assigned and enforceable, and the transactions costs are low. Transaction costs are the time, the money, the other resources it takes to come to an agreement on something. And that, to not just sign the agreement, but to like carry it out. So transactions costs could be hiring a lawyer. It could be the time it takes to go and negotiate a contract. In real life, it could be, don't want to say shame, but you know, some things people think you shouldn't pay for. So transaction costs would be like, I don't know, the judgment you get from trying to bargain over something. But Coase said, it doesn't matter who has the property rights initially. So if you have these two parties and there are property rights, as long as one party gets the property rights initially, they can reach the efficient outcome. One side will pay the other. You may have the polluter paying the other people to pollute, or you could have people paying the polluter not to pollute, or not to pollute. So the example he gives in this paper is a farmer and a paper mill that share a stream. So you've got the paper mill upstream, and they're causing some pollution, putting some pollution into the water that the farmer wants to use to help them grow their crops. So if no one owns a stream, so if there's no property rights, you end up with the mill pumping some waste into the stream, and now the farmer can't use it to grow crops. But we think about it, if the farmer owns the stream, farmer can do one of two things. Prevent the mill from discharging into the stream, so don't allow them to actually pollute. You can say, it's mine, I don't want you to do this to my property. Or allow the mill to pollute, but charge them a fee to do that. So if the mill is willing to pay more than the farmer can receive from those crops without pollution, in most cases the farmer will be willing to take that money. So if the mill can actually make the farmer better off, then they can pollute, and we've reached an optimal outcome. So either way, if we have good property rights in this case, we can avoid the market failure. If someone has the rights to the stream. And we could think of the opposite. We could have the paper mill owning the stream and the farmer paying them to not pollute, if they can pay them less than the money they're taking in for their crops. As long as we have property rights in this case, we have someone who can exert control over that. They're now bearing the cost or the benefit from what's going on. And what was really interesting, and what was like groundbreaking for this, is that Coase said it didn't matter who got the property rights initially. He said that through bargaining, you can reach a sufficient outcome. So the paper mill owned the stream, like I explained, we can end up with the same result, and we can still end up with an efficient outcome. We'll just change the parties who are paying. Typically, when policymakers try to think through how to solve externalities, they still think it's important for who deserves to get property rights initially. So they may say, well, the farmer is more deserving of property rights in this case, or the mill is more deserving of property rights initially. But when we have these clear property rights and low transaction costs, these two very important assumptions, doesn't matter who gets it first. Let's take an example where there's more parties. So typically when there's pollution involved, it's more than just one person who gets the cost associated with pollution. Normally there's a lot of people that have to deal with it. Anyone here from like Cumming County, Center County, maybe like Harrisburg? Okay, so you're along the Susquehanna River. All right, so the Chesapeake Bay watershed, it's like Susquehanna River goes up into like central PA, down out through Maryland. Chesapeake Bay was pretty heavily polluted, especially runoff coming from farms in Center County. That causing some serious problems down in Maryland. So in this case, there's a lot of farmers in Center County that are polluting the water, and there's a lot of people down in the Chesapeake Bay. So possibly, I'm not sure, but I'm assuming people fishing, like commercial fishers trying to get seafood from there. You have residents that live along the water that want to, enjoy clean water. Boaters and people that like to go down there to vacation, to enjoy the water. All these types of people that are being negatively affected in Maryland. So, can we use the Coase theorem in this situation? Potentially, but there's a lot of parties involved. There's a lot of farmers you have to talk to in Center County. And there's a ton of people down in Maryland that are bearing the cost of the pollution. So we end up with a lot of firms, a lot of people having to come to the table to negotiate. So we're gonna have high transaction costs in this case. Just getting everyone together to sit down at a table is gonna be expensive and time consuming. Trying to find a time that works for everyone, trying to reach everyone that's either polluting or that's bearing the cost of pollution. So in this case, we would not expect the Coase theorem to work. It works in very simple cases, but in these much more complex cases, it starts to break down. Again, because we're not meeting the two assumptions: the low transaction cost and the easy to enforce property rights and clear property rights. So the problem with the Coase theorem in practice is that you often have transaction costs. Now, sometimes they can be low. There's still a cost if you have, the neighbors and the fraternity getting together to come to an agreement. Still can be some difficulty there. But it's not as bad as when you have a ton of different people to deal with, like in the Chesapeake Bay example. So when there's a lot of parties, we end up with these high transaction costs. Additionally, property rights aren't always clear. So it's like impossible to figure out how to split up the air to who owns the air. So any pollution that goes in the air is very difficult to try to deal with using the Coase theorem. Water can be easier to figure out who owns, but there's still a lot of conflict over who has water rights. I don't know if she still teaches it, but Dr. D'Amico used to teach a class all about the history of water usage rights in the US and all the different conflicts that groups of people had over who had access to the water. It's a pretty big deal for California because they have to get a lot of their water from inland. So the conflict between areas in California and the places where they're drawing the water from. So even for water, which seems easier than air, there still are some difficulties in determining who has property rights. Because if someone damages your property, you have the ability to hold them accountable. You can charge them for it. You can use the court system to stop them from doing it. But when you don't have property to it, there's not clear property rights in it, very difficult to do this. So if people own the air, you could charge for pollution. It sounds kind of weird, but if you could somehow have property rights to some portion of air, you can charge someone who polluted. So going back to our frat house example, do you think the assumptions are likely to hold? This is more of a personal opinion than it is that there's an actual right or wrong answer. Are property rights clear to noise at night? Anyone want to venture a guess?
Don't you have to have a certain level of volume?
You mean legally?
Yeah, legally, yeah.
Yeah, normally there's at a certain point of the night, they have all you can't make. I think they just say too much noise.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I think that'd be level.
Okay, so you would say the property rights are clear enough in this situation?
Yeah.
You can't slice out a piece of noise or something, but you can tell if someone's making too much noise.
Yeah.
Any agreement or disagreement? All right, I can go along with that. How about transaction costs? Joe Kelly, you're wearing letters, so I'm going to pick on you. How easy is it to get 30 frat guys together at any one time?
Either easy or difficult, depending on how many there are.
Okay, so we're dealing with, even though it's just like the fraternity and the neighbors next door, there still are a lot of people we're dealing with. So do we need to get all the fraternity brothers together or not for this situation? Maybe not. If they think of firms, they normally don't bring every employee to negotiate in these things. They just hire counsel, or they have management handle it. So maybe you only need one or two fraternity brothers to handle it. They still need to get them all on board. Another idea, transaction costs. People don't think it's appropriate to pay for certain things. There's no market for kidneys, even though there would be, people would donate more kidneys if they were paid for it. So we think, it's wrong to pay for something like that. Do we think it'd be easy for two parties to transact over making noise? Anyone? I think it'd be pretty difficult. I would obviously be fine doing it because I'm an economist, so I think differently than normal people. But I think most people would be a little put off by that. Hey, we'll pay you guys to be quiet. What are you talking about? Or I'll pay you guys so I can be loud. Most people would find that weird. Okay, so the key insights from the Coase theorem is that when there are no transaction costs, initial property rights do not matter. When you have the farm, and the mill on that stream and there's just two parties, you have these clear property rights, it's pretty easy for them to negotiate. So it doesn't matter who initially has the property rights. But when we have transaction costs, the initial assignment of property rights does matter. Because it's costly to bargain, you want, the right party to have property rights in this case. And again, this is because it's costly to bargain. So with the example with the Chesapeake Bay and the farmers up in Center County, it's important who gets the property rights to the water. Initially, it was, you could say there are no property rights, you could say it was the farmers who were able to pollute. But now they've switched that to the people in the Chesapeake Bay, that they have property rights to the clean water down there. Later on, we'll talk about government action. And just like private action, government action has transaction costs. So actually getting lawmakers to pass a bill establishing property rights or implementing some sort of tax, there's going to be transaction costs involved with that too. And it's going to be a difficult process. Just like it can be a very difficult process with high transaction costs using the Coase theorem. I'll mention this later, but I'd also want to mention this now. You need to compare the cost for both of these types of actions. Not just look at the imperfections of one and assume the other is perfect. And select the action with the lower cost. You don't just tax the creator of the externality. That may be right in many cases, but in some cases it's not going to be the case. All right, so I know people really haven't been flying over the past year, but thinking back to when we were able to fly, does the person in front of you have the right to recline their seat? Tracer, what do you think? You say no? I know I get annoyed when someone in front of me reclines their seat. It seems like, in most cases, yes, because people still do it, or do a decent amount of it. So some guy in the New York Times suggested using the Coase theorem to do it. So pay the person in front of you not to recline their seat. They're putting a cost on you. They're making you worse off. We pay them to make yourself better off. They may be less comfortable, but hey, they get some money out of it. So the transaction costs, are they low enough here for this to take place? Has anyone ever tried it, first of all? I'd be impressed by that. I've never tried it.
Like, I purposely buy first class every time, so I don't have to deal with that.
That's smart.
I can't do it. I'm too big.
So we only have two parties being involved right here. So it should be easy, but some people think it's weird. All right, again, this is something that it's not normal to pay for, not common. Here's an example, article from Barstool Sports a while ago. Cam Newton offered to pay someone $1,500 to switch seats so he can have extra leg room. Not exactly the same situation, but he got up and offered the guy money, and the guy turned him down. I think that's nuts. I would absolutely do that. There's no way the flight cost $1,500, so he's like making a profit off this. Who would take the deal? A decent number of people. You're like, no, I'm not going to fit anyway. So there are transaction costs in these situations. You could think of transaction costs as people's unwillingness to barter over certain things or haggle over certain things. Make sure I hit everything I wanted to hit. All right. You guys have any questions about the Coase theorem, about how the Coase theorem works? Okay, so we have our two assumptions, and then if those hold, two parties can bargain and reach the best agreement. They can reach that socially optimal outcome. Okay, so last chapter we talked about how taxes cause economic efficiency, deadweight loss, because we moved the level of production away from the efficient level. So we were in equilibrium. We put this tax on goods and services. We've now moved ourselves out of equilibrium. The government gets tax revenue, but again, we now have this deadweight loss from too few of whatever product we're taxing being produced. One of the examples I used was sin taxes. Taxes on things like cigarettes, alcohol. I think they still call gasoline a sin tax, even though it's not quite the same as like alcohol or tobacco. The reason why we tend to see these for these bad goods, or these sinful goods, is that there's an externality associated with them. So if we could tax them, place a tax on this, the same amount as that negative externality, we could then move us to the efficient level of production. We can cancel it out. So last chapter, we talked about how those taxes work. We can now use them in the same mechanism to get us from this inefficient level of output, where we're not taking account the cost, to an efficient level of output, where we are taking into account the costs associated with these. So going back to pollution. Pollution is the most common example that we work with as externalities. Utilities don't bear the cost of pollution. Right, so we have the marginal private cost curve and the marginal social cost curve. So we're producing out here, Q market, whereas the efficient level of production would be here, Q efficient, where that curve crosses. So we're producing too much. There's a surplus compared to what would be efficient. Now remember when we worked with taxes before, it shifts the supply curve up or shifts it to the left. So we could place a tax that was equal to this externality, whatever that is, then we can move us towards the efficient equilibrium. So if it was exactly equal, this tax exactly equal to the externality, we can move the supply curve, S1, the private cost curve that the firm is facing, that's polluting, move it up to the cost curve for society, the marginal cost curve for society. At that point, we've now pushed it back to equilibrium, to this efficient level. So we end up with a higher price, but we've reduced the amount being produced. Before that caused a deadweight loss, now it's eliminating the deadweight loss. So it's the same basic mechanism, only we're using it to get to equilibrium, rather than knocking us out of equilibrium. So what do we see in this situation? When we place this tax on the producers of electricity to reduce pollution, we move from this curve S1 to S2, move along the demand curve. So we increase the price that's being paid by consumers, and we decrease the production from Q market to Q efficient. The price paid by producers is going to be P right here, where it crosses that initial supply curve at that quantity, because the difference right there is the tax that's being paid. let's say they put a $1 per unit of electricity tax on it, because that's the amount of the externality. You have consumers paying higher than they were originally, and we have producers receiving $1 less than that price consumers are paying. We have the rest of that money going to the government in the form of a tax. I remember before when we talked about taxes, we showed that deadweight loss. In addition to the tax revenue being taken in by the government, we still have tax revenue being taken in by the government. So the difference between the price paid by consumers and the price received by producers, so in this case, $1. So you get $1 tax times the number of units being sold. So all that is revenue for the government, so they're making money off this. But what happened to deadweight loss? In this example, so before we had a deadweight loss, we had too much being produced. Now we've used this tax to push us back to equilibrium, to this efficient outcome. So we've reduced the deadweight loss, if we get the tax rate to nothing, and we have government getting revenue. So this is actually a win-win. Before, when we talked about like cigarettes, we didn't include the externality in it. So we saw there was this deadweight loss. But because too many are being produced without any sort of taxes to take into account the externality, once we put a tax on it, we hit the right amount, we can move it back to eliminate the deadweight loss and have the government gain tax revenue. It's a win-win situation. So remember, taxes are reducing the amount of output when we place these like sales tax on the units of a good or service being sold. Negative externalities cause too much to be produced. So they literally cancel each other out. I'm going to really drive this home because it's an important concept to get from this. I'll just repeat myself. Does that make sense to you guys? How these work? So we have it working. We have these taxes counteracting this negative externality. Now, when there's a positive externality, we have the opposite problem. We have too little of a good or service being bought and sold on the market. So taxes obviously won't work. That'll just increase the shortage. But if we do the opposite, if we give consumers a subsidy or give producers a subsidy, we can encourage more production, more consumption of a good. So we can, again, reduce this deadweight loss and move us back towards equilibrium. So when you guys think about whether or not to go to college, you thought about things like how much more money can I make? Can I get a job that I like more, that I find more enjoyable? Can I go somewhere where I can have some fun? Anything else? Maybe playing sports, or maybe sports counts under fun. So you get these benefits from going to college. But again, there's these externalities where the communities you live in are going to be better off because you're more highly educated. So it's good for us if other people make smart decisions. It's good for us if they're going to be more attentive voters. They're going to be less likely to commit crime. All these sorts of things that are associated with getting a college degree. So this is an argument for a subsidy for college education. There's this benefit to communities that you guys aren't getting for going to college. So the government give you a subsidy to move your demand curve in line with society's demand curve for college education. So what happens here? We haven't talked about this yet in the previous chapter, so I'll walk you through subsidy in a little bit more detail. We start out right here. Demand curve 1 is the marginal private benefit before the subsidy being paid. So this is the benefit that you guys currently get from going to college. So the market for college, where that demand curve, the private marginal benefit curve, crosses the supply curve. So the Q market right here, the Q for the P market, the price. we're initially right there, but in an equilibrium, an efficient market equilibrium, we'd be up here. Again, the difference between these two curves being the positive externality being created. So you conceptualize that as the monetary value of living in a better world with more college-educated people. If we place a subsidy on that, if we give consumers a subsidy, that's going to increase the demand curve up to D2 if we price it right. So we now give them the subsidy, we're giving them extra money, so they're getting this additional benefit. But we're now willing to pay a higher price for it. So the new price is where this marginal social benefit and the marginal private benefit plus the subsidy, where those cross the supply curve. So we end up with a higher price being paid. You're willing to pay a higher sticker price. That's what firms are receiving, because you're actually paying a lower price. Again, at that new efficient quantity, where it crosses the original supply curve, demand curve. Then the subsidy. So even though you're paying this higher sticker price, a bunch of that is going to be the money you've been given as a subsidy. So you're paying this lower price to the consumer, and the producers are receiving a higher price, the price you're paying plus the subsidy. Now initially we had this dead weight loss right in this area from these transactions that should have taken place in an efficient market but didn't take place. We've now pushed up the demand curve out to here, so we're now at that efficient level. So we've reduced the dead weight loss. We've gotten rid of the dead weight loss, and now you guys are receiving the full benefit from a college education. Does this make sense to you guys? So these taxes and subsidies, we can use them to correct the externality problem. So instead of having private parties hash out amongst themselves, try to pay one another, we can have the government step in and place a tax or give a subsidy and end up with the same result, pushing us back to an efficient equilibrium. So the name for these types of taxes are Pigouvian taxes and Pigouvian subsidies, named after the English economist Pigou, who came up with the idea. Who basically was the one who sat down and thought about this and said, hey, we can use taxes and subsidies to fix this problem. I mean, it's not like you need to remember his name. Some people learn by connecting names to concepts. So if you do, that's one way to remember it. But if not, no big deal. So Pigouvian taxes are popular with economists because we're increasing efficiency. We're making the markets function better. We're also bringing in tax revenue for the government. So this is what they call the double dividend of taxation. So not only is the government getting more money, but we're also reducing inefficiency in the market. We're solving market failures. So we're being made better off in two ways. Can anyone think of a problem with using these taxes and subsidies in the real world? Because like the Coase theorem, there are going to be some issues. Think back to supply and demand when we first started talking about that. Remember, firms don't know the supply and demand curves. They can kind of estimate them, but it's not like there's a chart sitting there where we can actually say, yes, this is the supply and demand curve in this market. So firms don't know that. It's unlikely the government's going to know that because this thing doesn't exist. So it'd be difficult to figure out, well, just exactly how much is this externality worth? What is the cost of this negative externality? Or what's the benefit of this positive externality? So it'd be very difficult to get that exact amount. So we believe that college has a positive externality. I think that's a fairly common belief. But how much is that positive externality? What's the dollar amount? The difference between what society gets, the benefit that they get, and the benefit that that consumers are getting from it. It's a lot more difficult to put a number on that, what the actual positive externality is. So if we don't know that, and we mess up, we think it's less than it really is, so it's like somewhere between these two, we're still not going to produce enough. I'll draw that out so it's easier to visualize, rather than just relying on the slide. So here we have what's going on in the market when there's a positive externality. They're not taking into account this extra benefit. We're producing at a quantity that's too low and buying and selling at a price that's too low. This curve right here, D2, is our marginal social benefit. So it's what society gets. We're taking into account the externality. Let's say we underestimate how much the externality is. So we don't give a high enough subsidy. We'll end up somewhere in no. Here at D3. So this is where we want to be, this QE right here. If the subsidy isn't large enough, we're getting to this curve, D3 right here, where that crosses the supply curve. The quantity still isn't high enough. We've reduced some of the externality, but not all of it. So we're still suffering from deadweight loss. You can also overestimate how much the externality is. But the curve's somewhere out here. In that case, we end up with the opposite problem. We end up producing too much college. Consumers are consuming too much college. People that shouldn't go to college, it's not worth it for them, are now going to college because of the subsidy. So we've now created the opposite deadweight loss. Because we're unable to estimate these supply and demand curves, to know what they are ahead of time, we can end up with the wrong amount of subsidies. So it's important to note that A.C. Pigou, the guy who came up with this idea, said that there are problems with using Pigouvian taxes and subsidies. He said we can't expect any state authority will attain or even seek the ideal. Remember, governments are made up of people. People are fallible. So just like businesses make mistakes all the time, government can just as easily make mistakes. So we can't assume that it's going to be perfect. This is called the nirvana fallacy, when you assume that government policy has no cost, while assuming that the market process does have costs and inefficiencies. Or vice versa, where you assume the government is corrupt or unable to do it, but you think the market is perfect outcomes. In reality, both are imperfect. Trying to do some sort of Coasean bargaining for college education, it's going to be impossible. Trying to use Pigouvian subsidies to move us to equilibrium for college education, still going to be very difficult. You have to compare these two options as they exist in the real world with their real costs and benefits, not just what we imagine perfection to be. In the case for college education, it's really hard to imagine the Coase theorem actually working out. So despite that, we suffer from the knowledge problem, the lack of knowledge, you know exactly what those, in this case, the supply and demand curve is and what the actual externality is. It's still a much better option than trying to use private mechanisms to do that. But in other cases, it may be the Coasean bargaining that's much better because of the issue of not knowing how much the externality actually is. All right, we'll end there for the day and start next class with a couple other examples of trying to use Pigouvian taxes and subsidies to figure out, to move us back towards market